I'll then go and update the adult count to be 2 and the children count to be 1. I'll go and search for properties. Then over on our search results page, I will click through to our San Francisco loft. And then if I scroll on down, we'll see that the input field here has performed a calculation based on its price per night. Hello, my name is Lachlan Kirkwood, and today I'll be teaching you how to build an Airbnb clone entirely out of no-code using Bubble. Bubble's by far one of my favorite no-code tools, as it gives you complete control over creating your own custom database, front-end design, and also it allows you to integrate with third-party APIs and plugins. For those of you who don't know me, I've spent the past year working with the Bubble team to create their How to Build blog series. This series took a list of the top products out there on the market, like Uber, Instagram, and Twitter, and explained the process of recreating them entirely out of no-code using Bubble's tool. Throughout this tutorial, I'll be explaining the entire process you need in order to recreate your own version of Airbnb without touching a single line of code. This will include features like creating user accounts, adding properties to our marketplace, creating a custom search feature, as well as displaying a list of search results on a page, displaying the full information of a property on a dynamic page, as well as allowing users to book a stay, and then finally a feature that allows users to add reviews across our platform. So grab your Bubble editor and let's get right to it. The first core feature we'll be working on within our build today isn't actually a feature that our users will be using across our platform. Instead, we're going to go ahead and take the time to set up the necessary configurations for our database. Now, I've gone ahead and actually created a list of all the data types and fields within a Notion doc here. I'd recommend taking the time to also create something similar just so you can keep track of where you're at throughout the setup of your database. I find Notion quite useful as I can tick off each item as I've added it into my database. Now, if at any point throughout this module or even the whole tutorial you find yourself getting a bit lost, I'd recommend just taking the time to either pause the video or even rewind it so you can watch it multiple times. But let's go ahead and get into our build here. So we'll jump on over into our Bubble editor and head over into the Data tab here. Now, the first thing we'll need to do within our database is actually set up all the data types. And then within these data types, we'll be setting up the necessary data fields that lie within those data types. And you can already see that Bubble comes pre-built with a user data type ready to use. And that includes the data fields of the email, and it'll also store a password, but you just won't be able to view that in plain text. And what I love about Bubble's database, and it's something that I'll show you quite soon, is that you can actually link these different data types between the data fields. So for instance, if I was to create an Airbnb property and a user was to create that property, I could then go and pull out the information of that particular user who's created that property at any time throughout my application. This will all make a lot more sense as I actually add in all the data types and fields, so let's jump ahead and get into it. What I'll do first is add in all of the data types, because I will in fact be linking between the different data fields, and in order to do that you'll need to have your data type set up first. So as you can see, my Bubble editor already had the user data type created. So the next thing I'll need to go and create is the stay data type. Now in my tutorial here, I'm referring to a stay as a property. You could also call it that if you would like, but I'm just going to call it a stay. So I'll select to create that. Then I'll head back over into my Notion doc and I can see that stay images is the next data type. Now you might be wondering why I've created two different data types for the stay. One being called the stay itself and the other one being called the stay images. The reason I've done this is because I'd like to optimize my database for speed. And what I mean by that is if on our homepage we were displaying an entire list of all the properties/stays on our platform, it will load all of the content within every single property that's loaded on our homepage. So if we had 10 properties on our homepage, Bubble would automatically index all of the data that we need to potentially display every time each one is loaded. Now, if we've also got a list of images linked to our initial stay data type, it can quickly slow down the speed of our application, as it's not only trying to load all this content here, but it's also trying to load larger image files. So my best advice when you're setting up a Bubble database is to try and split out the image or files that you've created within a particular data type. And as I mentioned before, with Bubble's custom database, you can actually reference those at another time. So let's say I'm displaying a stay on my homepage, and I'd like to display an image from that stay. I could always refer to call upon an image that's linked to that stay. And of course, later on in our tutorial, I'll be showing you how we can connect those when we're creating a new property on our platform. So we'll go ahead and add in these two data types to our database. So there'll be a stay and then the stay images. I'll jump on over, I'll type in stay, create that, and then stay images, and also create that. And then there's two more data types I'll be adding. One is a booking and the other is a review. So I'll be adding those in, booking, and then I'll add in a review. Great, and now after we've added our data types, we can go ahead and flesh out all of the data fields that will lie within these. I can also see that I've accidentally added in two stays here, so I'm just going to go ahead and delete one of those. Just want to iterate that you should only have one stay and also the stay images. So let's jump back into my Notion doc and we'll start by fleshing out the data fields that lie within the user property. So I'll begin by adding in the first four on the list here, which is the name, the bio, the photo, and the profile type of the user. So over in my Bubble editor here, I'll select my user data type. I'll create a new field, and the field name will be called name. So this is the name of the user, and this will just be a text field. I'll go ahead and create that. The next data field is the bio of the user, which again will just be a text field. And then I'll go ahead and add a profile photo for this user, which of course will be an image data field. And then I'm going to go ahead and also create a data field called profile type. And the reason I'm creating this is because on my platform, I would like to differentiate between the users who are looking to rent out properties versus the users who are looking to host properties. And the way I'll be doing this is by creating a data field called profile type. And this field will be a text field. And again, later on in my tutorial, I'll be explaining how we can use this field to our advantage. Now back in my Notion doc, I can see there's two last data fields I need to create, and that is a list of all of the previous bookings a user has made, and then also a list of saved properties that they might want to look at later on. And you'll soon see that this is how we can actually link data types relationally across our database. So we'll go and create a new field, and this field will be called previous trips. And this field type itself will be a booking. So every time someone books a trip, it will add that into a list of all the trips that they've booked. And I will be selecting that this is a field with multiple entries, because a user can book more than one trip in their lifetime on our platform. I'll select to create that. And then we'll add one last field, which is a list of the saved stays. So this is all the saved properties that a user might want to look at later. And this, of course, will be a stay field type. So just a property, I guess, if you'd like to call it that. And of course, this will be a list with multiple entries. We'll need to tick that, because a user can save as many properties as they would like within their profile. So I'll go ahead and create that. And then back over in my Notion doc here, I can see that I finished adding in all the data fields for a user, so I'll tick those off. Next, we'll move into our stay data type, which has quite a few data fields. So because it's a property, I'll be registering multiple different data fields within this that a user might find useful upon their search. So we'll start by adding in the name, the description, the price, and the place type. So I'll go ahead into our database, I will select on the stay, And I'll go and select to create a new field, and the first one will be called name, which of course will be a text field. Then I'll add in another field called description, and this will also be a text field. Then below this, I will add in a price, and this price will need to be a number because it's a numerical value. And then I'll also be adding in a place type. So a place type will be whether it is an entire complex to themselves, if it's a shared room, or just a private room. And this, of course, will be another text element. Then back in my Notion doc, I'll tick off that I've added in those 4 data fields. And the next one I'll be needing to add is the images of the stay. Now, as I mentioned before, this will be linking to our separate data type called stay images. So the way we'll be doing this is creating a new field. I'll call this images. I'll select the field type to be stay images, so our separate data type. And contrary to what you might think that there is multiple images, I won't be selecting that this is a field of multiple images, because within our data type stay images, it will be able to host several images within it. And again, this will make a lot more sense when we actually go ahead and build that feature. But just for the meantime, I'm going to make sure that this isn't selected as a list of multiple entries. Then below our images, I'm going to add in a total count of how many adults, children, bathrooms, and bedrooms this property can host. So I'll go ahead and add in a field called adult count. This will be a number. I'll then add in a children count. And this will also be a number. And then I'll add in another field for bathrooms. And this again will be a number. And finally, beds, which of course will be another number field. Now I'll tick those off in my Notion doc. And the next thing we'll need to add is a range of booked dates, a location, and then also a list of all the amenities that the property has. So we'll start off with the booked dates here. So if I go and create a new field, I'll type in booked dates. And this itself will be a date range. Now, book dates is a way to filter out when this property has actually been booked, because obviously we don't want to display this property to a user if it's been booked on the same dates that a user is searching for. So by creating a date range, we will then later be able to exclude that from a user's search. So we'll go ahead and create that. Then the next field was the location of the property. And the location will be a geographic address. I'll create this. And then there was a list of all the amenities that this property has. So I'll start by adding in AC. And this will need to be a field set to yes or no. So it either does have air conditioner or it doesn't. I'll go ahead and create that. And what I will also do is update the default value of this to be no. And then we'll go ahead and also add in the next list of amenities. So there'll be a kitchen. This will be yes or no. And I'll go ahead and update the default status of this to be no. Then there is the option to have a washing machine. Again, this will be a yes/no data field. And I'll update the default to be no. And then finally, I'll add in Wi-Fi. And this will be yes, no. And then of course, I'll update the default status of this to be no. Now, for our example today, I'm only including 4 amenities, but if there were others that you would like to add in, I definitely recommend doing that within your database now. And then finally within our database, there's one last field that we'll need to add, and that is the published status of this property. Now, what I mean by a published status is that by the time a user creates a property, they might not immediately add in all of the data fields to make it functional on our platform. So what we'll do is we'll create a published status with a default of no, and then later on in our application, once all of this information is filled out, we can flip the published status to be yes, so that way we can then choose to display it within our application. So I'll go ahead and create a new field, and I'll call this published status. And I will update the field to be a yes/no property. And of course, the default of this will need to be set to no. Then back in our Notion doc, I will tick that off. And the next data type is our stay images. And this one's nice and simple. Because this is a separated data type, we only need to add one field to it. So it will be called stay images. And this will be a list of images. So we'll select that this is an image field, and we will be ticking that this is a field list with multiple entries. I'll then go ahead and tick that off in my Notion doc, and then we can focus on the booking data type. So this is the data we'll be registering when someone actually books a trip. So this will include the count of adults and children within it, as well as the actual booking dates, and then finally the property that the user is choosing to stay at. So we'll go ahead into our database, select the booking data type, and then I'll add in a data field called adults, and this will be a number data field. I'll add in another field called children, and this of course will be another number. Then I'll need to add in the booking dates, so the booked dates, and this will be a range of dates, so it'll have a start and also an end. So I'll go ahead and create that. And then finally, I'll need to link a property to this stay, so I'll just add in a field type called stay, and this will link to our stay data type. Now, a user will only be able to stay at one property at once, so I won't be selecting that this is a field of multiple entries. I'll go ahead and tick those off within my Notion doc here, and the final data type we'll need to add is the reviews. So in our database, I'm going to select the review data type. I'll start by adding in a data field called content. So this will just be the text of a review. I just call it the content. I'll go ahead and create that. Then I'll add in a field for the rating of the review. So this will be how many stars it receives. So this could be a number data field. Then I'll add in who the receiver is for this review. So this will be a particular host in this case. And this will be a user data field because I'll be linking it to a user who receives this review. And of course, one user can receive one review at one time, so this will not be a list of multiple entries. And then finally, I'd also like to link this review to a property. So I will write that this field is a stay, and then I will link this again to a particular stay within our database. So if a user writes a review about a particular property that they've stayed at, it will mark that review against that property and also the host of that property. And just like that, we've finished the last data fields that we need to add to our database. As you can see, it's easier than ever to create your own custom database with relational data fields and types within Bubbles tool. As I mentioned before, within this tutorial, I'll be keeping this pretty straightforward in terms of the data fields I'm adding. But if you'd like to add any additional data fields across any data type, I'd recommend taking the time to go and do this now. We can now go ahead and start to build out the first user-facing feature within our product today. And that is the actual homepage that allows a user to search for a property based on its location and a date range that they would like to stay from. This module will also have quite a few little specific tweaks that we'll need to add. So again, I'd recommend following on closely. And if you feel like you've missed anything at any point, feel free to rewind the tutorial and watch over that clip again. So let's jump on over into our Bubble editor here. And what we'll want to do first is go ahead and create a new page in our application. And I'll be calling this page the home page. Once the page has been created, I'm going to go ahead and just update the color of the background again. And because this page will be used by our users within our mobile application, I'm just going to update the size of the screen just so it roughly looks like a mobile device. Now again, I won't be actually focusing too much on the design of the page. I know Airbnb has quite a few nice hero images that they use. In this case today, I'm just going to be keeping it quite simple. And I'm just going to start by adding in a text element here. And this will say, where are you going? I will update this to be a H2 just so it's a little bit bigger. And I'll move that over to the side. And then below this, I want to add in an input element that allows a user to determine what location they would like to visit. So in this case, I won't be using just an input, I'll be using a search box, because once again, I'll be wanting to search for addresses or even cities or countries. So what I can do is add in the search box. I'll call this search box location, and then I'll update the choices style to be a geographic place. Now this will automatically index any address or location or city for that matter that a user is searching within. Then below this, I'm going to copy this heading and drag that down. And I will call this heading from, and then below this, I'm going to add in a date time picker. I'll drag that out to there. And I'll update the name of this one to be called from. And then I'm going to go ahead and copy both of those elements. And I will update this one to be called to. And of course I'll update the name of that as well to be called to. Now on our home page, it's possible for a user to add in a location they'd like to search for and also define what dates they would like to be traveling between. We will need to add one more feature, and that is a function that allows a user to identify how many adults and children are going to be within their stay, because we'll need to match a property based off how many beds or how many adults and children it has listed that it can take. Now there's a couple of ways to do this. You could easily go ahead and add in a drop down menu, and you could just add in a static choice of numbers, so it could be the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I will show you a nice little way today, and it's just going to take a little bit longer, but just to create a lot more intuitive user experience that replicates what the actual Airbnb app itself does. So I'll start by adding in a group element here today. I'll add this below both of the date pickers. And then I'm just going to update the style of this group to have a border, just so I can see its white background. And I'm going to go ahead and update the name of this group to stay count. Now within this group, I'll go ahead and add in some text elements. And the first one, I'll just call guess. I'll update that to be a H2. I'll also just center that horizontally within the group. Then I'll copy that down. And the next option or heading I will update to say adults. I'll copy that again. And you probably guessed it, but the next one will say children. Now what I'd like to do is create just like a manual selector that allows someone to add or minus a count of how many adults or children they'd like to take within their stay. So the way I'll be doing this is selecting a icon element. I will drag that there. And then I'm going to select from a minus icon. I'll move that over. And I will call this icon minus adult. Then I'm going to go ahead and copy that icon. I'll move it down to the children option. And this will be called minus children. Then I'm going to go ahead and replicate this icon again. I'll move it over so there's a space in between. And I'm going to update the actual icon to be a plus icon. And this icon will be called plus adult. And then below this, I'm going to copy that icon again. And this icon will be called plus children. Now, when a user actually goes ahead and adds in a count of how many adults and children they have, I won't actually be storing this data within my database because they haven't yet booked a trip. And I also want to avoid trying to create another data type that just stores every single request that's made, because that would quickly fill up my entire database with data that I just won't be needing to use later on in our application. So there is a way around this that is quite effective actually, and that is by using what's called a custom state. Now, a custom state just allows you to recognize that something is happening within your application, and you can manipulate data within a particular state at any time without having to actually save anything within your database. So I'll walk you through the step-by-step process of this, and we'll start by actually selecting our group element, and we'll be adding a state to this because all of these other smaller elements are sitting within this group. So I'll go ahead and head up to the information icon here on the group element, and then you'll see an option here to add a new custom state. The state that I'll be adding will first be called adult count, and this will be a number. So you can see here that we'll be keeping a count of the number of adults. Then I'm going to go ahead and add another state, and this one will be called children count. And of course, this will also be another number. Now, what we're going to need to do is create a quick little workflow that registers the actual state of how many adults and children there are once a user selects that they want a plus or minus one of those within their potential stay. So we can go on over and we'll select by creating a workflow that adds a number onto the adult count first. So we'll go into our workflow editor, and then within the action, we will just quickly type in state, and then you'll see there's an option here to set the state of an element. The element that we'll be wanting to set a state of is our group, and then within that we've already created two custom states, and the first one we'll be wanting to change is the adult count. And then the value that we'll want to change in this instance is the group itself, its current adult count, so obviously it's going to be set to 0 to begin with. And from here, what we're going to want to do is +1. So every single time this button is clicked, it will add one user onto that adult count. Now we'll head back over and create a workflow when our minus button is clicked. So we'll select to create a workflow. And once again, we'll be searching for state. We'll set the state of an element. The element will be our group stay count. The custom state will be our adult count. And the value of this state will need to be the group stays count, its adult count, and then we'll be subtracting 1 every time this button is selected. However, we're also going to need to add a condition to this element because we don't want a user to be able to minus a number when the current state is set to 0, meaning we don't want to store a negative number when we're passing this data through our workflow. So we'll only allow this action to trigger when the group stays count, its adult count, is greater than 0. Now we'll head back into our design tab, and we'll just replicate the exact same workflows for our children count. So we'll start with the plus icon. We'll select an action, and we'll select to set a state of an element. The element will still be our group. However, the state we'll be changing is the children count. And within the value here, it will be the group stays count, its children count, and we'll be adding in an additional number. Then finally, we'll go over to our design tab and select the minus option for children, create a workflow. We'll choose to set state of an element. The element will be our group stay count, the children count, and the value will need to be the current group's children count, and of course we'll be subtracting 1. And then once again we'll add a condition to this workflow that only allows it to run when the group's children's count is currently greater than 0 because we don't want any negative numbers. Now what we'll need to do is actually go ahead and create a way to display the current count that each of these values holds. Now, instead of just using a text element and inserting dynamic data, I'm going to choose to use an input element. And the reason I'm doing this is because input elements allow you to store and send data between pages, whereas a text element doesn't. Now, with an input element, you can actually choose to disable the input, so a user can't manipulate the actual content within this. And you can also update the style of the input so it doesn't have a background or borders, so that way it just looks more like a generic text element. I won't be doing that in our tutorial today because I want to focus on the actual workflows that we need to create instead. But I'll go ahead and update the name of the input to be called adult count. So the way I'll be displaying the actual count is by adding in some initial content here, and I'll be selecting from the group stay count, so the group that this element sits within, its current adult count. And then I'll go ahead and copy this element, drag it down into the children section. I'll update the name of this to be called children count. Just remove the mention of copy. And then I'll update the initial content I'm displaying to be the group's children count, which is the custom state that we've selected. Now, I would just like to go ahead and create a little bit of a user experience workflow where the guess field is actually hidden until a user has selected both the location and the to and from dates. So what I'll do is I will go ahead and unselect that our element is visible on page load. I'll also choose to collapse this element when it's hidden. And then I'm going to go ahead and create a condition on this element. And I'm going to go ahead and define a new condition that when the location search box, its value is not empty, and the date picker from, so our first date picker here, when its value is also not empty, and when our date picker from the to value is also not empty, I'm going to make this element visible. So I'll check that this should change the behavior of the element will be visible, and I'll select that that is true. Then below this, I'm going to go ahead and add in a button element. And this will just be a button that says search. And this will be the button we'll be using to trigger our actual workflow. And then before I go ahead and create this workflow, I'm going to quickly add a condition to this button to only display it when the adult count is higher than 0. Now, the reason I won't be selecting that the children count needs to be higher than 0 as well is because there will be cases where people are only searching for a stay, particularly just for adults themselves, whereas there won't be cases where people are searching for stays for just children. So we'll go ahead into our condition tab here. I'll define a new condition, and I'll say that when the input adult count, so our input here storing the actual value of our custom state, when its value is not empty, this element will be visible, and I'll select that that's true, which means that I then need to go into our appearance tab and unselect that this element is visible on page load. So now it will be hidden. Now we'll go ahead and create a workflow that stores all of the information from this query and sends it over to a search results page. So we'll go ahead and select to create a workflow when our search button is selected. Then within this workflow, I'm going to select a navigation event, and I'll choose to go to a page. The destination page doesn't yet exist, but I'll create a new page here, and I will call it search results. I'll select to create that page. Then I'll go ahead and choose that as the destination page. And I won't need to be sending any data through to this page because the page doesn't have a content type selected to it. However, what I will be doing is sending through what's called page parameters. Now, page parameters are a really effective way of sending through data that isn't stored within your database. And this data can just be temporary data, such as our location of the search and the date range of the search, as well as the adult and children count of the search. So what we can do is start adding in custom parameters, and I'll be explaining how we can extract this information later on our search results page. But the first parameter I'm going to add is the location of the stay. So I'll create a parameter key called location, and I'll want the value of our location to be the search box location's value, whether that be an address or a city that a user is searching for. Then we'll go ahead and add in another parameter, and I'll be calling this parameter start date. And then of course I want the value of this parameter to be the from date from our date time picker. Then I'll go in and add in another parameter, and I'll call this one end date, and this will be the value of our date picker 2. Then below this, I'll be adding in a parameter for our adult count, and this will be the value of our input adult count. And you can see here, that is why I used an input field to store that data, because we can now pull that data from that field, whereas we couldn't do that with a normal text field. And then below that, I'm going to add in a final one called children count. And this, of course, will be the input value of our children count. So over on my homepage, you can see here that there's just the location and the date fields displaying. There currently isn't the option to select a guest count or also select the search button, because we'll first need to add a value to these fields. I'll start by choosing a location. I'll search for San Francisco. Then I'll go and choose a date range. I'll say Feb 26th through to Feb 28. And now you can see that our guest option is displaying. I can then go ahead and add in an adult count. You can see I can add, I can subtract, and it won't let me subtract lower than 0. I can go here and select that there'll be 3 adults and 1 child. And now I'll go ahead and perform that search. Now you can see on our URL string here that we have been redirected to our search results page. Within that, it is also storing the location, which was San Francisco. And then also it has the start date, which was Feb 26th. And it'll also include the end date as well as the children count. And later on, when we're building out our search results page, I'll explain how we can extract that data from a URL and then use that to display information on our search results page. And just like that, we've finished building out the homepage of our platforms. Now that we have finished building out our initial search page that allows users to identify which particular properties and dates that they would like to stay at, we can go ahead and build out our actual search results page that displays a list of all of the properties that match that query. Let's jump over into our bubble editor and we'll go to our search results page that we'd previously created. Now, because this is a page that will be displayed to users, we'll need to go ahead and update the size, and I'll also just update the background color of it as well, just so it looks roughly like a mobile dimension. Now, the first thing I'll be doing is adding in a title to this page that displays some of the dynamic information that I can pull from the parameters that I'd sent through from my search page. In this instance, I can insert dynamic data and classify which particular parameters I'd like to pull information from. So I'll just start by adding in some static text. So I'll say stays in, and then I'm going to insert dynamic data. If I scroll right down to the bottom, there's an option to get data from page URL. And you'll see here that it's able to extract a parameter that we've sent through from our homepage URL. And the parameter name, of course, we saved it as location, and that was a geographic address. So now it'll be able to pull that information from the parameter and display it on our page. So I've just listed stays in, it'll be San Francisco based on my previous search before. Then I'll add a space, and then I will put from, and I'll insert the dynamic data, which is the beginning date of our stay. So if I add a parameter, so get data from page URL, the parameter I called it start date, and this was a date. Then beside this, what I'm going to do is format this date just as a month with a date afterwards. Then below this, I'm going to add in another space and I'll say 2. And once again, I'll be inserting dynamic data, which gets data from the page URL. And that parameter is end date. And then I will update the type of this to be a date. And then quickly format the way that the date is displayed to once again be the month as text and then the date after it. Now I'll go ahead and update the style of this font to be a H2, and I will just reduce that to a single line, and it will expand downwards if it needs to display more information in that field. Now the next thing I'd like to do is add a map onto the page that pinpoints all of the locations of properties that are relevant to a user's search query. So I'll scroll down and select from our map element here. I'll drag this element out to be the size of the page. And then within this map, I'm going to update the number of markers here to be a list. And the type of markers will need to be a stay because we'll be displaying a list of all the properties. Then I'll need to update the data source of the list of properties that we'll be displaying. So I will perform a search. I'll be searching for all of the stays within our database where the location that's registered with them is within, and you can add any custom distance you would like. In this case, I'm going to say is within 20. I'll choose kilometers. So when the location of a stay is registered within 20 kilometers of, and I will then be selecting the URL parameter that we've sent through from our home page. So I'll select get data from page URL. The parameter name was location. And of course, this was a geographic address. Now this map will index all of the stays that are relevant to a user's query. Now finally on this page, I'm going to want to display a list of all of the stays / properties that do actually match the user's query and are also available on the dates that the user has searched for. Now there is a little trick we'll be using to make sure that we can filter out properties that are available, because that is a key feature of Airbnb. And I'll explain this in more detail as we get to that. But first we'll go ahead and add in a repeating group to our page. I'll also just need to extend my page down. Now this repeating group, the type of content will be a stay because we'll be displaying properties. And the data source for this repeating group will need to do a search for all of the properties that match the parameters that we've sent through from a user search query. So the type of data we'll be searching for is obviously stay, and then we'll begin to add some constraints that match the page parameters that we've sent through. So we'll add a new constraint, and the first one will be the adult count. So how many adults that the host has listed this property can cater to. And then I'll select when the adult count is equal or greater to, and then I will scroll down to get data from page URL, and I will select adult count. And then I'll need to update this type to be a number because we're obviously sending through a number from our home page. I'll close that. And then I'll need to add another constraint, which is the children count. So when the children count is equal or greater to, I'll then select to get data from page URL, and the parameter I'll be searching for is the children count. And that of course will be a number as well. Now we're only filtering stays that cater to the relevant number of adults or children that a user is searching for. We will need to, of course, add in a parameter to filter out the location, similar to what we did with our map element above. So I'll go and add in a new constraint, and I will once again be searching from the location. And when the location of this stay is within 20 kilometers of, I'll scroll down to the bottom option to get data from page URL. And the parameter was our location. And I'll update that to be a geographic address. Now, as it stands, we're filtering all of the properties / stays in our database that match the parameters of the user's query. However, we're not actually yet filtering the stays based on the dates that they're available. Now, this can be quite a tricky thing to do in Bubble. So what we essentially want to do is exclude any properties that have a booked date that overlaps with the date that the user is searching for. And the way we'll be doing this is by once again using a custom state element. And I'll be explaining this as we walk through this process. So within our repeating group here that's going to be displaying a list of all our stays, we'll need to go ahead and select the information icon. And we'll go and then add in a new custom state. The name of this state will be called dates. And the state type will be a date range, because we'll be filtering through the beginning and end date of a stay that's been booked. We'll choose to create that. And so now that we've added a custom state, which is a date range to this repeating group, we're going to need to create a quick workflow that actually fills in the information that we need from the date range. And that will of course be the range that is sent within our parameter, so the beginning and end date of a user's desired stay. So we'll go over into our workflow tab here, and we'll choose to create a new event. and we'll be choosing from the general option every time that the page is loaded, because the only way that a user will get to this page is by performing a search on the initial home page, which then they'll be redirected over to our search results page. And every time this page is loaded, we'll perform an action and we'll search for the set state of an element option. And the element that we'll want to set the state of is, of course, our repeating group that we've just added a custom state to. And you'll see here there's an option to add in a custom state, which is our dates, which of course is set as a date range. And now we'll be adding in a value for a date range, which of course will be the beginning and end dates that have been sent through our page parameters. So we'll select to get data from our page URL, and the first parameter we'll be choosing from is the start date. And this type of parameter was a date. Then we'll select the more option and we'll be choosing from a range. So it'll be any dates that fit between the start date and the end date. So now I'll select the get data from page URL option. And the parameter here was called end date, which of course was another date. Now every time a page is loaded, it will set the state of our repeating group to identify the particular dates that a user is searching within. We can then head back over to our design tab, and because we've added a custom state to our repeating group, it allows us to filter down these particular stays even more. So as it stands, we're currently searching for all of these stays that meet these individual parameters. However, I would like to filter out all of those stays that do meet those parameters even further by the dates that they're actually available. So I'll go ahead and select the more option. I'll search for filtered and select that. And then from here, I can go and add my own custom filter. The constraint I'll be adding, I'll need to search for advanced, and this allows me to create a custom filter. And then within here, I'll be searching for when this stay. So because we're filtering a list of existing constraints, it will identify each individual stay as a stay within each cell of our repeating group. So when this individual stays booked dates, so when a user actually goes ahead and books a Airbnb, we'll be registering those booked dates as a date range. And I'll cover this more when we actually get to that point in our tutorial. However, at the moment, I just want to classify when this particular stay, so this cell's booked dates, overlaps with the repeating group stays dates. And because those dates are set as a date range, it will filter anything in between. And now it's registering any Airbnb properties / stays that have booked dates that overlap with the dates that a user has sent through within their query. What I would like to do though is select that I don't want to display these properties if they do overlap with those dates. And the way I can do this, it's a little bit custom, but I'll be selecting to format this option as text, and it'll give me the option to say yes or no. So it's creating a binary between two options. I can then go ahead and close that, and then I'll be selecting is, and just typing in the option of no. And because I have selected that this is formatted as text with a yes and no binary, I'll be writing that no against that particular binary I've just created. So now it's searching for all of the stays with an overlapping date, and when that is true, I've selected that I don't want this property to be displayed within our repeating group. Now I know that can seem a little bit confusing, particularly if you are relatively new to Bubble, but you will find that this will work a treat in terms of filtering out all of the stays that are already booked. And now that I've set the data source of my repeating group, there's one thing I would like to note, and that is that at the moment it is searching for all of the properties where the adult count equals or is greater than the value that has been sent through, and also when the children count is equal or greater to the value that's been sent through. But there will be some instances, as I mentioned in our previous module, where a user goes and books a stay only for adults and no children, whereas you wouldn't have a child booking on the platform to only have a stay for children, not adults. So what I'll need to do is go ahead and create a condition that when the children count from our page parameter is 0, we'll need to update the data source of this repeating group. So I'll head over to my conditions tab here and define a new condition. And then I'll be selecting a constraint that begins by getting data from our page URL. So when the children count parameter, and of course that was a number, and then I'll select is empty, so when it's 0 essentially, I will then go ahead and update the data source of our repeating group. And the data source of our repeating group will be the exact same as our initial data source, only we won't be including a count for children here. So I'll go back into my condition tab. I'll perform a search. I'll be searching for all of the stays within our database. And I'll start by filtering when the adult count is equal or greater to. I'll go ahead and get data from our page URL. The parameter was, of course, our adult count. This was a number. I'll close that. Then I'll search for the location. So when the location is within 20 kilometers of, I'll scroll down to get data from page URL. The parameter was location, and the type of parameter was, of course, a geographic address. And I'll then need to also go and replicate the advanced filter that we'd previously added. So I'll go ahead and select the More option. I'll search for filtered. I'll add a new constraint, and I'll include the same custom filter that I just added. So I'll search for advanced, and I'll be selecting when this stay's booked dates overlaps with the repeating group stays custom state dates. I will format this as text with a yes and no binary, and I'll say is no. And now that will just cover both bases where a user is searching for a stay with adults and children, and another option where a user is only displaying a display for children themselves. And then the other option where a user is only searching for a stay with adults itself. Now that we've configured our repeating group, we can go ahead and just update the appearance of the content that'll be displaying in this. And I'll go ahead and start by updating the layout style to be extended vertical scrolling, just so it collapses or expands based on how many properties will be displayed. And then I will also update the amount of rows just to be 2 to begin with. And then I'll go ahead and add in an image element because I'd like to display an image of this property to begin with. I'll just shrink that size down a bit as well. And then I'll insert dynamic data. And this image will display the current cell stay, so the property that it's sitting within, its images, and of course that's linked to the separate data type, which is images. And I'll also need to choose a particular image that I'd like to display. I'm just going to select a random item, so it'll just randomize every time that is loaded. And then next to this, I'll go ahead and add in a text field. I'll insert dynamic data, and this will be the current cell stays name. Then I can go ahead and close the gap in the repeating group, and I'll just add a heading above this that just says available stays. And I'll update that to be a H2 style font, and I'll just move that repeating group so it's in line with that. And then the last thing I'll need to do before I can go and preview this page is actually go and create another workflow that redirects a user to the individual property page when either of these elements is clicked. Because if a user is interested in a stay, they need to be able to click through and view the full information of it. So I'll select the image here, I'll create a new workflow. So when this image is clicked, I'll create a navigation event, I'll choose to go to a page. And the page I'll be wanting to redirect a user to is our stay page that we'd previously created. And of course, because that stay page has a data type which is a stay, I'll need to send through the data of the current cell stay. Now we can go ahead and preview what this whole experience looks like within our Bubble development environment. So over on our homepage, I'm going to begin by searching for a location, which of course will be San Francisco. That's where I registered my previous property.
I'll select the available dates to be the 26th of Feb through to the 28th of Feb. I will add in that there's going to be 2 adults and 1 child. I'll then go and search for that property, and it'll automatically pull in all the information from the page parameters. So it now says stays in San Francisco from my date range that I've added. It'll automatically display a marker on the map based on where that stay is, and I'll be able to show you in a later tutorial what this looks like with multiple stays on that map. But now at the moment you can see that our repeating group has displayed my loft. It's chosen a random image to display there, and then I can go ahead and click on this image here, and it will redirect me through to the stay page and send with it the unique identifier for this particular stay. Now back on my Notion doc, I'm going to tick off that I've finished building out our search results page, which allows us to pull information from our page parameters that were sent through from the home page and display things like the dates as well as a map with markers on it. And then I've also created that advanced filter that allowed us to filter through properties that didn't have overlapped book dates. And that is all I have time for in this tutorial today. If you were interested in checking out the rest of the course, I'd recommend clicking the link in the description to purchase the full course. Within the complete course, I'll be walking you through the step-by-step instructions to complete the rest of our build. You can also get access to a suite of Bubble tutorials where you'll learn how to build other popular products. If you'd like to get started building some other popular products for free, I'll be sure to include some suggested links at the end of this video. Thanks again for taking the time to watch, and be sure to hit that subscribe button if you'd like to see any other useful tutorials to help you on your Bubble journey.